There's a small town in western Minnesota that's hidden itself on the edge of what was once Lake Agassiz, the prehistoric inland ocean. And if you have time to take in the vastness of farmland, you can see the same rolling landscape, the same earth that the pioneers tilled, where they planted and together harvested their grain. Today, these hills are pedestals for farm machines of a bygone era, remnants of the steam age that stand like great ancient dinosaurs and give silent greeting to those coming to an area that owes its existence to the steamers. The town, Rollag, is of Norwegian heritage, and the people that live here today are very much like their forefathers, who, with those steam threshers, created enough power to coexist with the land. It's steam power to which they owe their legacy. That and the hard labor of generations before them who worked the land and made the area prosper. It's a fitting location, then, for the museum that's here. A museum that, more than anything, speaks in a cherished voice, preserving a period of man too powerful to forget, and tells us of the spirit of those pioneers. The museum grounds span over 100 acres, where during 4 days in the fall of each year, 40,000 people visit the landmark of area history. It's also fitting that a site devoted to history had a humble origin, an origin sprung by those who helped shape the history. The Western Minnesota Steam Threshers Reunion, the organization which sponsors the annual event and preserves the machines on exhibit each year, was in part inspired by Norman and William Nelson of Rollag. It was a nostalgic dinner conversation which led the brothers, with another brother Chris, and a handful of others, to revive their 1912 Gar Scott steam engine. The engine had been retired in 1937 and replaced with a more modern machine. On August 20th, 1940, the group moved their operations to the old Nelson farmstead across the road from Williams, where they threshed all day with steam.
Western Minnesota Steam Threshers started in 54, then we organized them and elected a president. And I had been a steam engine thresherman practically all my life, see, and at that time steam engine threshing was going out. The combines were taking over, see. So that's what inspired me to preserve, try to preserve some of the steam engine days.
What began as a gathering of neighbors to revisit the steam age burgeoned into an event that drew interest from the entire region. Today, the Western Minnesota Steam Threshers Reunion has nearly 900 lifetime members, and the festival attracts people from across the United States and from Canada. The Steam Threshers Reunion has grown into a 4-day event that features not only steam and gas-powered engines, but other displays that reflect the heritage of the area. Threshing demonstrations are given, the machines are paraded through the grounds, cultural exhibits are provided by ladies involved in candle making, quilting, soap making, spinning, weaving, and bread baking, and Scandinavian foods are prepared. The evening entertainment at Rollag has become an event in itself, with Scandinavian and German music, tunes from 1900 on up echoing throughout the hills of Rollag. Tracing the progression of the celebration since the first official reunion in 1954, one notes that thousands of man-hours have gone into making each year a little different. Activities have been expanded. Construction has been done to further improve the grounds. New engines have been acquired as efforts are made to impress spectators who return year after year. In 1960, the Western Minnesota Steam Threshers Reunion incorporated under the statutes of the state of Minnesota, and in 1973 became affiliated with the Minnesota Historical Society. William Nelson lists some other attractions that visitors will find of interest.
There are over 20 steam engines, close to 150 gasoline tractors, over that number of stationary gasoline engines, 2 large stationary steam engines, and 1 30-foot upright steam engine, 3 reconstructed pioneer log houses, blacksmith shop, threshing machines, sawmills, miniature land where local craftsmen are threshing and sawing with their miniature handiwork. A flour mill is busy grinding flour. A newspaper is published daily on the grounds. There is a large parking lot and large campgrounds, and also a beautiful lake. is enclosed within our acres.
All of the activities at the reunion are designed to give enthusiasts, young and old, a taste of life from the turn of the century.
And I can remember those days when we actually thrashed. And I remember as a young person what excitement there was when the day to thrash at your farm was. Because I grew up on a farm, and those were just exciting days. And I can still remember my mother and sisters, you know, baking pie after pie to prepare all the food, and boy, those were big days. You know, you really looked forward to them because it was kind of a festive air about it then, too. You hear that engine start up, why, you still get the same feeling you did back then as a young boy.
You know, one of the cultural things that's happening down at the show is the reliving of the old musics.
You would see dozens of people getting up on a stage and performing that probably never performed any other time throughout the year. And I can remember some of the first shows that I had a part of. We had to lead them up there, and some of them entertained the group with their backs turned to them because there were that much fear in them. As time went on, we no longer have that problem. We have the problem we've got too many, so they're coming out of the rafters.
One segment of the reunion that has grown tremendously is the ladies' activities. The women not only prepare satisfying meals that feed the crowds from dawn to sunset, but have become involved in many of the cultural and craft exhibits that take place on the grounds.
The ladies involved out here, I think, are involved because this has become such a family thing. You know, rather than in the beginning when steam engines, you talk steam engines and old tractors, it was, mainly men that enjoyed it. Well, I know my first experience would have been to have sat in the car and read a book. You know, you can only look at tractors for so long, and then it was better to become involved. As long as the men enjoyed it, why not the ladies find something to do? And that's initially what we did. We took on smaller things and started and found out there were more women that felt the same way we did. We get the women involved, we get the family involved, we offer something for every age group, and I think that's why Rolog is such a great family thing. We have a number of women in our membership that have steam engineer operator's license. That's what they choose to do, to get down there and do the firing and run the controls, and that's great too.
I've had my license for 4 years, but I've fired boilers for about 9. But I've only been on the engine a couple of years.
I just found out I could do it, and I enjoyed doing it. Well, this is my 4th year on this engine, but I've had my license for about 5 or 6. And I've been around steam engines for most of my life. My dad has a Nichols and Shepherd, and he's working on a half-size Gar Scott. He's got that about complete. It's 8 of us up here, my dad, my husband, and we have 3 boys, and they bring some of their friends along, too. I've been right inside the boiler chipping away the old dried-on lime and scale and stuff. There's not too many people that can say they've been inside a boiler, but I've been there. It's kind of neat.
They're acquired pretty much from hearsay. You hear about somebody who says, when I was up in the woods hunting last year, we came on an old engine sitting, and it had trees growing through the spokes. And so the person who hears about that goes up into that area and starts looking around, and sure enough, he finds this thing, finds the owner.
Our engine is a 4-cycle diesel engine made in 1903. Made by the De Laverne Machine Company of New York City. The engine comes from a sheet metal factory in Nevada, Missouri, and it powered a line shaft that operated sheet metal equipment. Well, we're interested in all kinds of antiques, and we've been showing engines for about 17 years or something like that. Our children are involved in our engines, and they get dirty working on them, and they have grown to appreciate them. And myself, I have more of appreciation for the way things probably were in the earlier days. This engine has shown how the life of some of that stuff was. And we learn as we go, too. We have about 15 engines out here, mostly big engines.
From a historical point of view, the steam engine is really the reason that the Industrial Revolution took place. It's the reason that we have industry as we have it today. The steam engine started being developed in about the 1690s, where the first successful steam engines were being developed in England. And you could probably say that they came over here very shortly thereafter.
This land that we're on was settled mostly by Scandinavian immigrants, and it was settled in the 60s. It started being settled in the 60s, and from then on a very heavy settlement took place. This land was farmed initially with horses and with an awful lot of handwork. The steam engine on the farm initially was a boiler on some wheels with an engine on the top, and it had to be dragged around by horses from job to job. And the only things you did with the steam engine at that time was belting it to these newfangled, larger threshing machines. So you're seeing the development of a larger and larger steam tractor, which now is being asked to plow. And this develops a whole new kind of steam engine, strangely enough called the plowing engine. Many different companies made these very heavy and large plowing engines with special heavy gearing, terrifically large drivers, rear wheels with extensions on them, 3 feet wide and more. If you just go west into the Red River Valley with miles and miles and miles of flat land, you can imagine what these plowing engines were able to do. So the steam traction engine in this area certainly changed the face of this country, and much of what you see is because the steam traction engine was here. It had a really very short life, however. The steam traction engine started coming to this area perhaps in the 1880s in very small numbers, and already in 1910, 1912, the same companies making the traction engines were getting into the production of large gas tractors, some of which you see here, some of which look very, very much like the steam engines.
Well, I think most of them thought it was a wonderful labor saver, which it was. The very early settlers here beat the grain out with a flail. And I guess a man could, I've been told that if you could beat out 7-8 bushels, that was a good day's work. And of course with this threshing machines, why, they could thresh 1,000 bushels or maybe 2,000 bushels a day. Well, it took a lot of help in those days. The steam engine probably back in the turn of the century, pretty near all the steam engines around here were fired with straw. So it took one man as a fireman and one to run the engine, called the engineer, and one to haul water for the boiler of the engine. And the engine used a lot of water. We had some tanks on wagons in those days, pulled by horses. And each tank held around 400 gallons of water, and it would take usually about 5 tanks a day. And then we had a man on the separator, and if we were thrashing out of stack, it took at least 4 men to pitch bundles into the threshing machine. And they had wagons to haul the grain away, so maybe it took 2 or 3 wagons to haul the grain away from the machine. In all, it took about 20 men to run a successful big steam outfit.
I fired one of these for 3 falls with straw, poking straw in it for heat.
That was quite a job all day long. It was pretty busy folk, you know. The straw didn't last very long, you know.
I guess so.
Yeah, I've been at it since I was just a kid, you might say.
Yeah.
Although they quit threshing and then they started with gas tractors, you know, so I wasn't along much on that.
Yeah.
But I always loved steam. That good smell, you know.
Yeah, you like the smell, huh?
Yeah, straw and steam, that has a good smell to it. Now, you turn this valve open here. This is the water valve in the tank. Open this, and you pull this steam injector here. And the steam travels through a venturi. That creates a vacuum and sucks the water out of the tender against 120,000 pounds of pressure. You don't pump it in.
Yeah, that's
just steam circulates, brings the water in.
The guy that thought of that, he was a smart man.
Yeah.
I still don't know how it works.
Here at Rolog, we're recreating the past, not just by operating old machinery and painting it up and showing it to people, but we're recreating the human part of the past, in that there was a time when the harvesting of crops particularly was a group effort, and neighbors from an entire area would get together, and first one farmer's harvest would be brought in, and then another until the work was done. We're doing that, I guess, to a certain extent here. We're all gathering together, not just to harvest, though we do a lot of that, but hundreds and hundreds of people come here, camp out, and work, not just 6 or 8 hours a day, but in some cases 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day during the show, and for a lot of the summer before the show, for absolutely no pay to do the same thing, namely to put on a show that attracts, in a good year, 50 or 60,000 people.
We have people who have never known there was a steam engine until they happen to be hoodwinked into coming out to Rolog one year, and they say, "My golly, this is, I love this. I've got to get involved." Other people grew up on it in childhood. We have, of course, many of our older members actually ran these engines when they were young, and so it's rather natural that they're there.
What can it be about the old machines that attract so many people every year? What inspires those who have found a place for them in their everyday lives? Steam and gas engines of every description can be seen throughout the grounds, so the hard, rustic life of the pioneer is conjured up by spectators watching the machines operate. The 100-year-old J.I. Case engine, the 3060 Huber that has 8-foot drive wheels, machines that range from the 10-horsepower gas engines to a 200,000-pound industrial stationary engine, from a miniature railroad to a 75-ton locomotive.
I grew up 3 miles from the showgrounds here, and I remember coming up here, sitting on my grandpa's shoulders and watching the steam engines. And I always wanted to do that.
And now you do it.
And now I'm doing it.
You know, you get a little steam cylinder around coal smoke, and your blood is awful hard to get it out.
Get rid of it, huh? Yeah.
Kind of took me under their wings and started showing me the ropes and everything, and just kind of stuck and just fell in love with it, basically. Because if I didn't love it so much, I don't think you could pay me to do this job.
You know, it's a thing to do now. It used to be if you're kind of collecting things, you're kind of nuts, you know, but now I guess you're in style if you do it.
Well, let's put it this way. I come 600 miles to be at Rolog every year. Does that kind of answer that?
I think it's very great. I think it's the greatest.
Oh, I had a grandfather who was a steam engineer, and I was very interested in mechanical things. From the time I was about 6 or 7 years old, all we ever talked about was steam engines. He built a little model, and by the time I was 12, I was quite conversant with steam engines and how they ran and this sort of thing. So, and then he died when I was 20, and just a year after that, I started coming out here and running engines. So it's been quite a while.
We're looking at the Montana boiler. It supplies steam for the steam hammer over here, the saw rig, the coreless inside, and the Pabst engine next door. This is a 126 boiler horsepower, and the boiler itself came from the oil fields in Montana, and it was used there to inject steam down into the holes, and the steam would loosen up the oil so they could pump it out easier. And I don't know for sure how many years it was used there, but it was moved to a sawmill also in Montana, and it was installed and plumbed up and everything, but the night before the sawmill was to go into operation, it burned down, so it never got used there, and history gets a little sketchy from there, and it was found laying on its side in a ditch.
This is a steam-powered forging hammer, and it was used in St. Paul and the Great Northern car shops for forging hot iron, whatever kind of parts they made. It's got a patent date of 1876, and it's steam-powered. The hammer in front there weighs 1,500 pounds, and we can raise it up with steam or force it down with steam. And it was meant to pound hot iron. We're not using it for that purpose. It's not practical for us to forge hot iron at a show. So we are doing these commemorative plates, different one every year. It takes 450 to 500 ton of pressure and hydraulically to do that, if you want to compare it.
I learned from just trying it, really. There was 3 of us who started out here, and we just kind of learned by seeing what the hammer would do after we hooked up the steam and had everything ready, and we had the dies and everything, and we experimented a lot with it. Of course, the fellow who actually designed and built the die has done work similar to this before.
A fellow named Jerry Parker and I saw the thing sitting in the weeds, and we decided to take it on as a project. And maybe you know the philosophy of Rolog is that everything should work. If you have a hammer, it must work. If you have a boiler, you build a fire in it, and if you have a train, you run it on a track. So we searched for a means of finding something that would demonstrate the ability of this hammer. So we came up with a bicentennial project. As you can see, the first plate was a 1776-1976 Liberty Bell.
Where does the inspiration come for the rest of the pictures?
People tell us various themes. The board of directors makes the final decision, or we get board approval. We try to get something that appeals to everyone.
How long of a process is it that it takes you to create?
A few nights after supper.
Oh, well.
No, it's hard to say. I mean, we work at it. It depends on how close to Rolog you are. If you got 2 or 3 months remaining, you've got a 2 or 3 months job ahead of you. When it gets a week ahead of the time for Rolog, then you can get done in a hurry.
One example of how much devotion there is to restoring old steam machines is the work that went into the resurrection of steam locomotive number 353. Engine 353 was purchased by the Western Minnesota Steam Threshers Reunion in January 1972.
This particular engine came from the Sioux Line Railroad, and when they quit using it, Copper's Coke in St. Paul used it. And when they got done with it, Rolag bought it for about $1,000, and then was when the work began.
On a cold day in February of that year, 12 loyal reunion members decided to attack the worn-out locomotive as it sat outside a beautiful old roundhouse in St. Paul. On that long day, every bit of pipe, valve, and gauge was stripped from 353. The crew labored to remove the 36 bolts that held the boiler to the saddle as well. In March, a crane lifted the boiler from its home and placed it onto a lowboy trailer headed for Fargo and the yard outside Larson Welding and Machine. There, 3 welders gave their evenings and weekends to the project. The duplex air compressor was torn down and rebuilt. The old cab was torn off and a new one fabricated. The boiler exterior was sandblasted and primed. Meanwhile, the running gear of the locomotive was pushed into the roundhouse in St. Paul, where it was torn down completely and built up from the bottom. The frame was jacked and blocked, the 3 driving pairs were rolled out towards the door, and the frame was torn down. In May, a fire hoop was used to heat each of the old tires so they'd come off the wheels. New tires were ordered from a company in Pennsylvania and were put on using the fire hoop as before. The day came when the running gear was ready to be shipped north to be reunited with the boiler. A large crane was hired, and the machine was loaded on a truck and hauled to Larson Welding. In March 1977, arrangements were made with Burlington Northern in Dilworth, Minnesota, to obtain the use of a stall in their roundhouse for the completion of the project.
But I could hear that they were quite excited. Can you imagine a couple of old farmers, old ones at that, going to come in and work on a locomotive, steam locomotive? This is going to be an interesting summer. I was a young fellow and grew up, and my mother told me that I'd walk out as far as the sidewalk, and 2 blocks north is where the Milwaukee and the Chicago Northwestern Railroad is. The depot there. I could stand there about an hour and just watch them trains. I was about 2 years old. I can remember this as plain as it is today. And when I grew up, of course, I just had that train fever. And I finally rounded up $2.50 and sent to Sears Roebuck for an encyclopedia on locomotives. And I memorized that thing. We didn't have much reading material, and that's all I had to do. And I never dreamt at that time that 60 years later I was going to have use for that. And it come mighty handy.
The running gear and boiler were hauled out to the yards, and after several years of being apart, the boiler was again placed in its home on the running gear in June of 1977. Finally, in March of '78, a ramp was made, track laid onto the ramp, and the locomotive was pushed onto an immense lowboy trailer. Slowly it made its way to Rolog with the 150,000 pounds of motive power, and was met by 2 50-ton cranes, which offloaded the engine onto tracks on the Rolog grounds. A miniature railroad was bought in 1973, and together with the purchase of a scale model train, created a special attraction for youngsters. Also, railroad depots from Hixson, North Dakota, and Baker and Hitterdall, Minnesota, were moved in to recreate the ambience of the old-time railways. Today, a Northern Pacific passenger car that bears the name Mount St. Helens is exhibited on the grounds for visitors to pass through to relive another part of a bygone era.
This older type or hand-set sawmill was used to produce lumber in your smaller mill setups from, I would say 1920 into the early 1950s. With a crew of about 4 experienced people, you could produce about 5,000 board feet a day. We acquired the mill in July of 1985, and the shed was built during the summer of 1986. Much of the lumber that went into the shed was sawn on this mill after it was set up. The steam engine was an excellent source of power for your smaller or moderate-sized sawmill operation, for the simple reason that you could burn the slab wood from the squaring up of the log. The slab wood and the edgings could be burned in the engines. So some of these early mills were, I would say, about 75% self-sufficient. The shingle mill, to the best of my knowledge, was acquired in about 1960 by the late John Nepperud. He restored it, and it has been used to produce shingle for a number of the buildings on the grounds. The miniature sawmill was built by a gentleman by the name of T.A. Paulson back, I would say, in the late 40s or early 50s. And Mr. Paulson passed away. Western Minnesota Steam Threshers bought the miniature sawmill then. We have tried to use it as an exhibit every year. Last year, special shed was built for it, or in 1985, a special shed was built, and the mill was housed permanently in this building. And it's usually powered by a half-scale case steam engine.
Flossie's Laundry is a collection of Maytag washing machines. The wooden one over there is a 1914 model, and then there are some newer ones, 1917. And further over there's a washing machine that has a butter churn and a meat grinder on it. Those were accessories that were manufactured for the washing machine. The show of '86 is my third year in the building. The machines are powered by gas engines or electric engines. Ours are powered by 32-volt engines because that was kind of the thing in those days. Unless you were close to electricity, then you could have an electric motor. In our particular building, we power it with 32 volt. The lights and everything are 32 volt.
Well, that's a steam engine, and that was originally in the flour mill at Freeport, Minnesota. My dad and uncle bought it in 1915. We ran it on the flour mill until 1966, and in '69 they moved it up here. And about 4 or 5 years later, I moved that little experimental flour mill up. Makes white flour and the whole bit, whatever products come out of wheat. Well, the engine was down there, and of course we wanted to get it out of the building, so it at one time almost went into for junk. But then a cousin and myself, I finally decided that we'd advertise it. There's a magazine, an Iron Man's magazine, and of course we had inquiries from all over the United States on it. But when they found out how heavy it was and how big it was, a lot of people didn't want to move it. And from that same magazine, Rolog saw the ad too. And of course, they came down and looked at it, and they were very interested in it. So I think this all happened in '68. In the summer of '69, they came and moved it out and moved it up here. I donated the engine, but they moved it and had the expense of moving it and putting on a foundation. So that's how I got going up here.
Well, that's how the engine got going up here.
Yeah.
You personally get...
Well, I followed the engine. Grew up with the engine. Dad ran it all the years, and of course from a little tyke on up to until that time had a lot to do with it, and kind of glad it stayed where it did, or as close to home as it is. I'm about 140 miles east of here, so it's just like coming home to the old mill again, or really to the old engine. It's quite an experience every year. I don't have too much to do with the engine anymore. There's other guys that run up, usually busy with the flour mill. And everybody seems to get along real well here too, which is one of the big things. The guy enjoys coming back. Well, it's little tykes like this, they find out how the forefathers did things. I myself knew all about steam, but there's kids that grew up at my age and never knew anything about steam. The railroads had steam engines. Well, they're all gone, you know. As a kid, I watched a lot of those. And like I said, I think it's real important that it's here. It would be a dirty shame for some of this stuff to wind into junk.
And so that's what primarily is coming back?
That's right. Get back to the old engine. Now this mill has 2 sets of rolls. Now in a big flour mill you might have 12 to 15 sets. In my flour mill at Freeport we have 10. But in order to get flour out here you have to grind it several times over the same rolls. So you grind it, and of course the lower box is a sifter box that goes around and sifts. The flour grinding process is pretty much grinding and sifting. Now on a big mill it takes 4 grinds to get the bran off, or the outside hull. Then of course you start grinding the inside down on different rolls again. Here you have to do it with 2 rolls and keep on setting the rolls closer together and finer to get it to flour. These are the rollers now. The rollers are in here. They're pretty hard to see, but they're in there. That's the rollers. And of course, this is the sifter box. That goes around in a circle. That's where you get your separation. Is in the sifter box. Like I say, anything that isn't fine enough will come back over and get ground over again.
I believe I started on that Pabst engine in 68. And when I first saw it, it was lying in the grass, disassembled, in pieces, all in pieces. 400 or 500 pieces, I suppose. They were just scattered. And because it was a difficult project, it was the only reason for considering it, because it was something that had not been done before. But there was no blueprints. There was no directions. What was most interesting, an old piece of iron could be made to run by some amateurs. And as it runs, it impresses me as being perpetual. It appears to run at ease. It appears as though there's no strain. It appears that it would run and run and run. Well, the engine is an Alice Chalmers manufacturer for the Pabst Brewery in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the brewery had a twin to this engine. There were 2 of those engines in their powerhouse, and it supplied all of the power for the brewery. And they were used until late in the 50s.
It's no different going to Rolog than going to the Rarig Center or the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as far as I'm concerned. What you're looking at the Rarig or at the Met or anywhere else are, in many cases, older works of art. When you come to Rolog, you're looking at works of art. They're the art that was turned out by the mechanical engineer for a certain purpose. And yes, I feel it's a very cultural event.
At a electric generator or alternator that powered a plant, William Boxon Lumber Company in St. Paul from 1904 to about 1959 for all their electric needs. The flywheel is 16 feet in diameter, weighs 19,000 pounds. We have a 4-foot stroke, a 12-foot connecting rod here. It's a 20.5-inch bore. It's a coreless engine made by Twin City Ironworks. It's got a 20.5-inch piston. We got a hold of information about it in about 1969, and in 70 the guys moved it out and brought it. They took it out of an existing building, put it in this existing building, and had it running here in 1971. And I have been here with it since '72. This thing really amazes me in the way it had to be machined and worked with the equipment that they had of the day. You know, I mean, they don't have big cranes to move things like they do now. And you can see how quiet and easy it runs even today after being built in 1904, you know, and it was used for 50-some years.
The way I got started in this business, I come up here and seen Norman Nelson's little engines. And then I had to go home and try it, see if I could do it. So
How many years ago was this?
Oh, this is 25, 30 years ago. And I built this engine first. That took me 3 winters. And I had to have something for the engine to pull. So I built a little separator. And that took another 3 winters. And I've been bringing them up here just every year now since I got them built, so they worked.
Can I go out and buy a little kit and make one of these myself, or what do you have to do?
No, you have to start from scratch. For instance, the worm gear on that weigher head is a left-hand double lead worm gear. I had the big machine outside my shop, and I took measurements from that.
So every day you'd run out with your ruler and measure,
Right,
and
I made many trips.
and back to the garage and pound and hammer and
Right.
out to measure.
The engine is actually easier to build than the separators, less parts. I didn't have a big engine to go by, so that took a lot of time to just get the measurements. The cast iron pieces on that engine I made the wood pattern for and took them to the Fargo foundry, and they poured the iron for me.
Have you ever considered seeing a psychiatrist?
I probably should have. Yeah, people see this thing running and it works, and they seem to get quite a kick out of it.
From the original steam threshing farmers still living to the youngsters at reunions today, the gap that is often so wide between generations has been bridged.
We've got a number of 3-generation, and I think we've got 1 4-generation coupling of engineers or workers out here right now.
Well, we are very fortunate here. We have so many young people interested and they're doing a swell job.
Oh, I love working with steam. It's great. It's almost like a second life to me.
Well, we've done quite a bit to encourage young people, and I think that's the real future of our show, you know. Because these young people will eventually be the old-timers, and I've been told, you know, that these shows won't last long because all the old-timers are dying off, and I say that's wrong. It's just it'll be a new group of old-timers, and won't be long till I'll be one of them. And we have some excellent elderly people that seem to really cater to the young ones, and they just love them, and they'll do anything for them, and that's where they catch the fever too.
I always tell them it's good medicine for us old folks.
Yeah, we've got 3 little guys that have been coming back for 3 years. They showed up one year, and we had some pretty lumpy coal, and we like to use finer stuff because it's a lot easier to work with, and the smoother the fire, the better, you know. And they asked what we could do, and didn't have too much for them except busting up coal, and they dove into that right away, and I figured, well, this will probably last for about 10 minutes and they'll kind of disappear, you know, because busting coal is not a fun job. And they stuck around, and all that show, and they were back again the next year, and they've been coming back, so we're kind of breaking them in too.
Oh, I'm very happy about it. Because we got to have the young people if this thing is going to keep going. At the time we started, I was one of the youngest ones, you know.
It's kind of a fever that you get, and once you get the fever, you can't shake it, and it just gets worse all the time.
What is this fever?
Well, just that you're so interested in seeing these projects develop and new things happen down here to bring something from the past alive again, and it's just a super bunch of people, the greatest bunch of people I've ever known of any organization I've ever belonged to. They all seem to have a common cause and aren't afraid to work to accomplish it.
We're all here kind of for the same reason. We enjoy working really hard, and preserving part of our past.
They aren't just mechanisms. I guess they are when they're sitting there cold, and when they're warm, they have their own personalities. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why there is such an attraction to come back and to work on them, to fix them up, and to plan things for next year, because you get so much reward. I guess each one has its own personality.
It preserves our heritage of people who do not know who their ancestors are, how they lived, and that certainly have no real ties to the past and have very few ties really to their country. They don't know where they come from and they don't know where they're going.